A well-meaning friend suggested that I use AI to add another 40 pounds so my fat photo, the one on my thumbnail, would look like I looked when I was over the line and technically obese. And sure, it would have been visually more dramatic, probably got more views, but it wouldn't have been honest. And I feel with so many false claims throughout the internet and outright dishonesty with predatory weight loss providers, you absolutely deserve, at the very least, my honesty. And by the way, there are simply no photos of me when I was obese, either time, because those photos simply don't exist. And I ask you, can you relate to that? I mean, who wants to have their picture taken, when you're at your top weight? I didn't. So in this video, we're going to talk about me watching the train wreck of my repeated weight gain on into obesity while I knew exactly what was going on and I was helpless to stop it. Hi, I'm Jason Stanley, a social research scientist focusing on field research and clinical trials on obesity. Now, I'm here to help you understand and heal that unrelenting urge, that nagging voice that just says you've got to eat when you're not hungry and way past when you're full. Now, we call that urge the food monster. My job is giving you freedom from your food monster. Today, we'll begin looking at my obesity journey. It's part one of a two-part series. So not only am I a researcher into the cause and cure of obesity, I was also a longtime sufferer of weight gain and obesity. Long time as in decades. So this is my story from thin to fat, to thin to fat. Far too many times to count. And I mean, really, that sounds like hyperbolic, but the truth is, I thought about it and tried to go back to how many times, and I couldn't remember all of them. I do remember very clearly that I made it to obesity twice, about 10 years apart. That first time that I really thought I had it, it was what we call affirmative repatterning, and it was coupled with cognitive behavior therapy. You may know it as CBT. And I'll get into that a little bit at depth here in a minute. What about others? Because I'm not the only person that thought I knew how to get around it, right? Well, everybody, you know the drill. Lifestyle and diet. And in under diet is what? Well, it's vegan, keto, carnivore, you name it. And they all work until they don't. Home hypnosis, exercise, etc., and etc. Now, I regularly still hear these answers in personal conversations. I hear it in day-to-day life. I hear it at the gym. I hear it at social events. And in a moment, I'm going to discuss why I felt I had the answer. But first, I think it's appropriate here that we cover a little groundwork. And the reason I think it's appropriate is because this is more important than just me telling you my story. It's my story. No, it's more important than that. And in many ways, it can be your story. So please watch for how parts of our stories are similar or even the same. Now, in past videos on this channel, we learned that the root driver of obesity is a brain-based compulsion that was built during childhood. Now, when I say brain-based, let's understand it's hardwired into the physical part of the brain. This is not your, what we call mind. It's not your character. It's not that you have flaws. It's not that you're weak-willed. It's none of those things. It's physically in the brain. So this compulsion, your food monster, based on what was going on during your childhood, then can either be big, like Godzilla, or it can be small and modest, like Dino the Dino, which is the cute little dinosaur in the cartoon The Flintstones, or it can be somewhere in between. Now, there's a link in the description to the video where I talked about how size does matter. And I urge you to watch that if you haven't done so already. Now, we're going to be talking about my monster, right? So, what was my monster? Well, it's more than that cute little Dino the Dino, but it's not a Godzilla either. It was more towards that small end. It was kind of modest or moderate. Even though it was modest, it was kind of like a really good con artist. It was in the back of my mind and it was very sneaky. I mean, it would come up and just kind of gotcha. And I frequently was able to control it, but it was always exhausting. Now, if it wasn't really active, it was always lurking. So let's talk about how my food monster was developed, what my childhood looked like. Now, again, this probably not your story. It's uniquely mine, but start looking for the parallels, and I'll build some more in a moment. So, what is my story? Well, I'm a member of the Clean Your Plate Club, and again, only at a small level. So let's go back to when I was a kid. My mom, she was a child of the 1930s Depression, and so food to her was a big issue. She really, 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 really hated to throw away food because there was times when she was a kid and they were truly, literally hungry, sometimes for days. So, but she had a pretty healthy way about it. Now we had all the rules of when I was growing up. Back in the 50s, you had to sit up straight at the table, and you couldn't eat with your mouth open, and you had to hold your fork correctly. There were things that you had to do. But as far as the food went, my mother had one rule, and that was I had to take a bite of everything on my plate. Her logic and what she told me was, look, if you don't take a bite, how do you know if you really don't like it? As long as you take a bite. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it. Sounds pretty good. She was just trying to be a good parent. So that's kind of how my story went. But let's take a look at what really happened there, because this is subtle, and this is what's happening with your life, sometimes very subtle, sometimes very not subtle, but even with your children or your grandchildren. I remember very, very clearly. I hated lima beans. They were like the worst, right? So my mom she served us up, and she would put a scoop of lima beans on my plate. So I would be watching her, and I'd watch her, and so I'd make sure she was looking at me, and I'd take that one lima bean. I'd work and work and work till I got one lima bean on my spoon, and I would eat it and chew it, and then make sure she was watching me. She'd usually smile and nod, and then I would go ahead and eat the rest of the food. And when I was finished, there was always that scoop of lima beans sitting on my plate. And I said, "Mom, I'm done." She'd look at my plate, and you could see her face. She was sad. She said, "Well, you going to eat your beans?" A little hope in her voice. Say, "No, Mom, I really don't like them." "Did you try one?" "No, we'd done this many times before, but did you try one?" "Yes, Mom, and I really, really don't like it." "Okay." And she would be sad. You could tell her voice and her face was sad. And she said, "Really? Are you sure?" Check in 2 or 3 times. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Mom, I really don't like them." "Okay." So she'd get up, she'd pick up my plate, walk over to the trash, and sad, she'd just kind of depressed, she'd scrape the beans off into the trash. Now, compare that to any other day. Maybe we had spinach. Now, I didn't particularly care for spinach, but it was okay. And so we had the other things on the plate, maybe some macaroni and cheese or some fried chicken. And I would eat everything, and I would eat my spinach. So when I said, "Mom, I'm done. Do you want seconds?" "No, thanks, Mom. I see you've cleaned your plate." And she would smile and her eyes would light up, and she was really happy with me. And, I could see that. She didn't say anything different, really, but she did. The whole thing about her was happy. And she was my mom. I paid attention. She'd reach across and she'd rub me on the top of my head and say, "Oh, you're my good little eater. You're such a good little boy." And then she'd say, "Would you like some dessert?" And yes, of course. And it's usually, "Do you want a cookie?" Or sometimes she'd say, "We have ice cream. Do you want some ice cream?" "Oh, absolutely." So I would get ice cream. Now, when I didn't eat the lima beans, she'd scrape the beans off and say, you're dismissed. I wasn't in trouble, but boy, when I did clean that plate, I got reward. I got the reward of her smile. I got the reward of the ice cream. All was good in my life. And that is what wired in a particular, very specific part of my brain called the amygdala, that I am good when I eat. So if you feel you're getting value from these videos, please subscribe and help the channel grow so we can get this information about eating and compulsive overeating is not your fault, and that there is a way to heal it. So the people who you know, please share this with them. Help them learn it's not their fault and they can get help. So please help hit that subscribe button. So in the rest of this video, we're going to talk about where I've been, how long I struggled with emotional eating, overweight, and obesity, and what I tried that kind of worked, but then didn't. So back to when I was a kid. I was a thin kid. I was thin. I was never chubby. Moving on into my teens and early 20s, I was that 97-pound weakling on the beach. They were the ones that you saw on the back cover of comic book advertisements back in the 50s and 60s. And so I was that kid that was skinny, and the big guy with the muscles would come by and kick sand on us, and I couldn't do anything about it, right? So later in my mid-20s, I was an older student. I was what's called a returning student. I'd already been through the military. So I did a research project on medical anthropology. And in that project, I discovered that obesity was connected to childhood lifestyle, what happened in childhood, and that the things that we thought were basically what it was, right? And we still think so today. Diet, health, exercise, all of the typical reasons were not the underlying driver of chronic adult obesity. I was fascinated, but typically it should have just been a college paper that I turned in and forgot about it. It wasn't my world, but for whatever reason, I just couldn't let go of this idea. It was childhood. It wasn't these things that people talk about. So I continued to talk to anyone who would listen, explain my ideas. And more importantly, I continued to interview obese people, both men and women of all ages. So that was just an interest, and that's how I developed this large body of information just by talking to people and listening to what obese people told me. Then, might even get a drum roll on this, in my 30s, I suffered a serious work injury. Yeah, the injury was painful, and there was some recovery, and there was a lot of things going on. But while that was happening, the long-term and what I term now as grinding stress was present. That grinding stress, for me, I'd lost my career. I was never going to be able to go back to it. And so the fear of unemployment, the fear of not being able to support my family, these things were big and they weighed heavily on me. So during this over a year there, I bloomed. And when I say I bloomed up through overweight all the way to obesity. Now, during this time, I 100% knew what was happening. But even though I knew, I couldn't not overeat. And I talked to myself at every day, at every bite, right? And so what? I ate more. The more I ate, the more depressed I became. The more depressed, the more stressed. The more stressed, the more I ate, and the more I ate, the more weight I gained, and then the more it's a spiraling downhill slippery slope. As I said, I was aware of every bite, and I hated myself for it, yet I was unable to stop. Now, I knew intellectually from my work earlier, I knew that I had a compulsion. I knew it was caused from my own childhood, and yet I was totally unable to do anything about it. So I watched in horror. I'm sure you've done the same thing. I watched in horror as I gained and gained and gained. Fortunately for me, time passed, and the grinding stress kind of let up. I got another career. I was able to go back to work. And so as everything kind of just relaxed and my life got a little closer to on track, well, I dieted and lost much, but not all of the weight. Hooray, hooray, right? I'm good. So, right? Thank God. I don't know about you, but I don't mean to be silly here, but wow, it felt so good. So let me ask, so far, does this sound anything like your story? Not the Clean Your Plate Club, although I'm sure a lot of you are members of that club, but the stress, this grinding stress, this just kind of constant underlying stress, is that anything that's, is familiar? Now, where I was expected to clean my plate, what about you? Were you a member of the Clean Your Plate, or was perhaps mealtime the happiest time of the day? Did you eat in front of the TV? And remembering or think about it, TV is entertainment. This is not a time of stress, so you're feeling good. Did you look forward to snack time at school or at home? Then the next question, when did you first become heavy? Now, all of these things are there's a mix and it's different for each person. On the when were you heavy? Well, as you know now, I was a late bloomer. I didn't become heavy and medically obese till I was in my mid to late 30s. Were you like me or early? How about experiencing that grinding stress and gaining weight? You see, now that one's not just common, it is the most common life story. Over the years, I've interviewed well over 1,000 obese people, and I can tell you it's standard. So I got obese. I dropped the stress, lost most of the weight, but then for the next 10 years, I yo-yoed, lose the weight, then uncontrollable weight gain. That became my life, where before it had been a fascinating insight, it became a personal problem. Now, if you watch my earlier video, why listen to a social scientist, you know how the culture changed from the 1980s, where the subconscious was considered a brick after adolescence, to around the year 2000, to a more common belief that we could change ourselves, change our thinking, change our mind, change our life, reparent ourselves. That became a thing. We could build deep internal positive vibes, and forgiveness freed our own subconscious. So, sick and tired of the yo-yo and encouraged by the change in culture, I dug in. I dug into all of these ideas, and I was living part of it. It had been really, really successful in freeing me, making my life better. So I wrote the book, published the first book, and then I followed up with a clinical trial. I know that's all backwards. I should have done it the other way, but I just was unsophisticated in this kind of work. After all, like I say, those things worked on me. Forgiveness and mental attitude really improved my life. But unfortunately, it didn't work. Now, I did lose the weight, but was it because I was doing those things, or was it because I was just so gung-ho and my food monster is not that big that I could control it? Well, the weight came back. So again, how much is familiar to your story? Again, not the details, but the process, this last part here. The high hopes, the work, the success, temporary, and temporary success, and eventually the dashed hopes, and then the failure and the depression that comes with failure. Now, I should end this video on a high note, a point of success, but that just isn't how my life with the weight war has worked. And we're coming to the end of this video. In part 2, though, the success is in part 2, which I'll release next week. I'll take you through more years of my work and trials, temporary success leading to failure, but finally I will show you in the next one what I learned, how I became a natural eater. I'll show you that a natural eater, this is where I am now, eats what they want, when they want it, as much as they want, without worry and without weight gain. Sound too good to be true? Well, look around. There are plenty of natural eaters all around you. They're those thin people that mostly, we're the people we love to hate because they get the chocolate cake and we don't. So until part 2 is released next week, thank you for watching.